My mother-in-law always looks down on my black adoptive parents. I grew up as the daughter of Lisa and Daniel, a black couple who adopted me after I lost my biological parents at a young age. Though our family faced poverty, they provided me with something far more valuable than material wealth: unconditional love and unwavering support. Lisa, with her gentle yet firm guidance, was the light of our small home, teaching me compassion and resilience. Daniel, with his quiet strength, showed me the importance of hard work and integrity. They didn't just give me a home. They gave me a foundation to stand on. As a white child raised by parents who were often judged for adopting me, I witnessed their sacrifices firsthand. Lisa worked tirelessly to ensure I had opportunities she never did. And Daniel's steady presence reassured me during life's most challenging moments. Their love transcended race, poverty, and prejudice, instilling in me an immense gratitude for the family we built together. I owe every success in my life to the values they taught me: kindness, strength, and the courage to stand tall in the face of adversity. They weren't just my parents, they were my heroes. I met Ethan during college, and from the moment we started talking, I knew he was different. His kindness, intelligence, and genuine interest in understanding my life made me feel seen in a way no one else ever had. When I told him about my adoption and the incredible love Lisa and Daniel had given me, he didn't flinch or question it. Instead, he admired my parents for their strength and selflessness. His acceptance of my background deepened our connection, and it wasn't long before we knew we wanted to build a life together. But Ethan's mother, Margaret, was a different story. The first time I met her, she greeted me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When I introduced her to Lisa and Daniel, the air grew tense. Margaret's words were carefully chosen but carried a sting. "It's nice to meet the people who raised you," she said, her gaze lingering a moment too long, as if scrutinizing every detail. During dinner, she made a passing comment about how hard it must have been for them to provide for someone so different. The words, though cloaked in civility, pierced like a dagger. From that moment, it was clear Margaret didn't approve. Her subtle but cutting remarks about Lisa and Daniel's race and socioeconomic background set the tone for every interaction that followed. While Ethan defended me and tried to smooth things over, I could feel the weight of Margaret's judgment every time we were in the same room. Her disapproval wasn't loud or overt. But it was persistent, an undercurrent of tension that threatened to disrupt the harmony Ethan and I worked so hard to build. The first time Lisa and Daniel came to visit Ethan and me in our home, I wanted everything to be perfect. I spent hours preparing a meal that I hoped would reflect the love and care they had always shown me. Ethan, as usual, was supportive, helping me set the table and calm my nerves. But the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away because I knew Margaret would be there too. When Lisa and Daniel arrived, their warm smiles and easy laughter filled the room, momentarily easing my anxiety. Lisa, always gracious, handed me a bouquet of flowers she'd picked herself, while Daniel, ever the joker, teased Ethan about the game he'd missed the night before. But the warmth was soon met with Margaret's presence. She stood at the doorway, her posture stiff, her smile stretched just a bit too wide. "Lisa, Daniel," she said in a voice coated with sugary politeness, "welcome. It's so lovely to finally meet you." Her words sounded kind, but her eyes betrayed her discomfort. She didn't step forward to shake their hands, instead gesturing vaguely toward the dining room. As they moved into the house, I noticed how Margaret lingered behind, observing them like they were guests in a museum exhibit rather than my parents. Ethan gave me a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder, but I could feel the tension growing. Dinner started pleasantly enough, with Ethan doing his best to keep the conversation light. Lisa shared stories about her garden, and Daniel recounted a funny mishap at work. Margaret nodded along but contributed little. Her expressions veiled and her responses clipped. Then, as the meal progressed, her true feelings began to seep through. "I imagine it must have been quite an experience for you," Margaret said, her voice deceptively casual as she swirled her wine glass. "Raising someone so different from yourselves. Such a unique perspective on life, wouldn't you say?" Lisa paused, her polite smile never faltering, though I could see the flicker of hurt in her eyes. "We never saw it that way," she replied gently. "We just saw her as our daughter." Margaret's smile tightened. Of course. But it must have been a challenge, given the circumstances. I mean, financially, socially. It couldn't have been easy." The room went silent. Daniel placed his fork down carefully, his jaw set, though he said nothing. My chest tightened as I looked at Ethan, hoping he would step in, but he seemed frozen, his gaze fixed on his plate. I took a deep breath, determined to defend my parents. Lisa and Daniel gave me everything I could have ever needed, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. They raised me with more love and support than many people ever experience. Margaret's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. Oh, I'm sure they did their best. It's just admirable, really, given the circumstances. The words hung in the air like a slap. Lisa reached over and placed her hand on mine, a silent gesture to let it go, but the damage had already been done. Margaret's barely concealed disdain was palpable, her words laced with judgment that she didn't bother to hide. As the evening wore on, Margaret's digs continued, subtle yet cutting. She avoided addressing Lisa and Daniel directly, instead directing her comments to Ethan or me as though they weren't even in the room. It must be interesting, she mused at one point, to navigate family dynamics when things are so unconventional. By the time dessert was served, my patience was hanging by a thread. Lisa and Daniel, ever gracious, thanked me for the meal and complimented the house, but I could see the weariness in their expressions. As they left, Lisa hugged me tightly, whispering, "Don't worry, sweetie. We're proud of you," while Daniel gave Ethan a firm handshake, his smile polite but strained. After the door closed behind them, Margaret wasted no time. "Well," she said, her tone as sharp as ever, "that was certainly enlightening. I can see why you hold them in such high regard, though I must admit, it's not what I expected." I felt a wave of anger rise in me, but before I could speak, Ethan stepped in. "Mom, that's enough," he said, his voice firm but not loud enough to make an impact. Margaret sighed dramatically, waving a hand as though dismissing the entire evening. I stood there, feeling torn between gratitude for Ethan's half-hearted defense and frustration that he hadn't done more. Margaret's disdain wasn't just directed at Lisa and Daniel, it was an attack on the foundation of who I was and the people who had made me the person Ethan claimed to love. That night, as I lay awake replaying the evening in my mind, one thought consumed me: this wasn't over. Margaret's judgment was not something that could be reasoned with or ignored. It was a battle I hadn't chosen but one I knew I would have to face head-on if I wanted to protect my family and the love that Lisa and Daniel had given me. The dinner table was a battlefield disguised as a gathering. Margaret sat at the head, poised like a queen on her throne, her voice carrying an air of effortless authority. She steered the conversation with precision, ensuring it never left the orbit of topics that showcased her wealth and sophistication. "Our latest renovations have truly transformed the house," she remarked, her tone dripping with self-satisfaction. "Ethan insists on keeping things simple, but I believe a home should reflect one's aspirations." Lisa and Daniel exchanged a glance, their smiles warm but uneasy. My mother adjusted the napkin in her lap, the slight tremor in her hands betraying her discomfort. Daniel, always a steady presence, attempted to pivot the conversation. "We've been working on the garden lately. It's not much, but it brings us joy." "Oh, how quaint," Margaret replied, her words as sharp as glass. "Gardening must be so therapeutic when one has the time. For me, managing the properties keeps me far too busy. But I suppose simpler pleasures are valuable too." The subtle dig landed like a blow, and I felt my stomach tighten. Lisa's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Daniel nodded politely, his usual humor muted. I wanted to speak up, to defend them, but the fear of escalating the tension held me back. Instead, I sat frozen, a silent witness to my mother-in-law's calculated display of dominance. Margaret continued her verbal conquest, each word carefully chosen to emphasize her superiority. "It's always fascinating to hear about something different. Perspectives on life," she mused, her eyes flickering briefly toward Lisa and Daniel. "I imagine your experiences must be quite unique." My father's jaw tightened, his usual composure cracking ever so slightly. Lisa, ever graceful, responded with a simple, "Every family has its own journey." I clenched my fists under the table, the heat of anger bubbling within me. Yet I stayed silent, unwilling to shatter the fragile veneer of civility. As the dinner progressed, my parents' discomfort grew more evident, their laughter softer, their words fewer. Margaret's dominance was absolute. Her subtle jabs leaving an invisible but undeniable mark. That night, as I helped my parents into their coats, Lisa whispered, "Don't worry about us, dear. We're fine." But the hurt in her eyes told a different story. As they left, I felt a surge of guilt for not standing up to Margaret, for letting her words linger unchallenged. I promised myself that next time, I wouldn't let her win so easily. The summer barbecue should have been a day of joy, filled with the laughter of family and the aroma of grilled food wafting through the yard. Instead, it became another stage for Margaret's thinly veiled disdain. She arrived impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to the casual attire of everyone else, her presence as commanding as ever. From the moment she stepped into the yard, it was clear she intended to make herself the center of attention. As the family gathered around the table, Margaret's tone grew sharper. "You know," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to command attention, "I've always thought upbringing plays such a significant role in shaping a person. It explains why some people turn out unconventional." Her eyes flicked toward me, a smile playing at her lips, though it held no warmth. I felt the words hit like a slap, their implications unmistakable. Lisa, sitting beside me, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, her hands busy arranging plates. Daniel, ever the diplomat, attempted to defuse the tension. "Different experiences make people stronger," he said, his voice steady. But Margaret ignored him, continuing as if he hadn't spoken. Throughout the afternoon, Margaret's interruptions became more frequent and blatant. Whenever Lisa tried to share a story, Margaret would cut her off with an unrelated anecdote about her own achievements. "Oh, that reminds me," she interjected once, barely letting Lisa finish her sentence. "When we were in Paris last summer, we attended this exclusive wine tasting. You wouldn't believe the caliber of people we met." Daniel, visibly irritated, tried to steer the conversation back, but Margaret's dominance was unwavering. When he mentioned a project he was proud of, a community program he'd helped organize, Margaret waved it off with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, that's lovely," she said, her tone patronizing. "It must be so fulfilling to do simple work like that." The dismissal was palpable, a clear message that in her eyes, their efforts and experiences held no value. I clenched my fists under the table, my frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Every word out of Margaret's mouth felt like another jab, another reminder of how little she thought of the people who had raised me. When Lisa excused herself to check on the food, I caught the slight droop of her shoulders, a rare crack in her usually composed demeanor. Daniel stayed silent, his lips pressed into a thin line. The jovial atmosphere I had hoped for had dissolved into a quiet discomfort, the weight of Margaret's words hanging heavy in the air. As the evening wore on, I found myself replaying every insult, every condescending remark. The anger simmered within me, not just for myself but for the parents who had given me everything despite having so little. Margaret's words weren't just an attack on them. They were an attack on the very foundation of who I was. By the time the barbecue ended, the tension was almost unbearable. Lisa and Daniel left with polite smiles, their dignity intact despite Margaret's attempts to undermine them. But as I watched them walk away, I felt the sting of guilt for not standing up to her, for letting her dominate yet another family gathering. Inside, I vowed that this would not continue. The day had been a turning point, a moment where I realized that keeping the peace could no longer come at the expense of my parents' respect, or my own. The community event was supposed to be a day of celebration. A chance for everyone to come together and enjoy the camaraderie of neighbors. The air buzzed with chatter and laughter as people milled around, dressed in vibrant summer attire. Lisa had chosen a beautiful, flowy dress in her favorite shade of yellow, a color that complemented her warm personality. She looked radiant, as she always did when surrounded by people she cared about. But Margaret, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, found her way to make an entrance. She swept through the crowd, her tailored dress and polished demeanor making her stand out. But not in the way she likely intended. Her presence commanded attention, but the kind that drew wary glances rather than admiration. I was standing beside Lisa near the refreshment table when Margaret approached. Her smile was as cold as ever. She looked Lisa up and down, her gaze lingering on the cheerful yellow dress. "Oh, Lisa," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern, "I wish someone had told you the dress code. This is a semi-formal event." After all. The words hit like a slap, and for a moment, the air seemed to still. Conversations around us faltered, and I saw people exchange uncomfortable glances. Lisa stiffened beside me, her fingers tightening around her plate, but she said nothing. She had always been gracious in the face of adversity, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. Margaret, oblivious or perhaps delighting in the discomfort she had caused, turned her attention elsewhere, leaving Lisa and me standing in the wake of her comment. I tried to lighten the moment, offering Lisa a supportive smile, but the damage had been done. The warmth in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of humiliation she tried to hide. The rest of the event passed in a blur, my anger simmering with every passing minute. By the time the event ended, I knew I couldn't let Margaret's behavior slide. That evening, when the house was quiet and the echoes of the event lingered in my mind, I decided to confront her. Margaret was in the living room, sipping her usual evening tea, the picture of self-assured composure. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. "Margaret," I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside, "we need to talk about what you said to my mother today." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Oh, that," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I was just trying to help her fit in. I didn't mean anything by it." The casualness of her response made my anger flare. "It didn't come across as helpful," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "It came across as condescending and cruel." She felt humiliated. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her teacup poised midair. "I think you're overreacting," she said, her tone icy. "I can't be blamed if she took it the wrong way. Some people are just too sensitive." Her words cut deeper than I expected. Not just for their content but for the sheer lack of accountability. It was clear she had no intention of understanding the hurt she had caused. In her eyes, Lisa's discomfort and mine were inconsequential. I left the room before my emotions could spill over, retreating to the solace of my bedroom. That night, I lay awake, replaying the exchange in my mind. Margaret's words echoed, a bitter reminder of her unwillingness to respect the people I loved most. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about Lisa or Daniel. It was about me, my boundaries, and my refusal to let Margaret's toxicity overshadow the love and warmth my parents had given me. Ethan's silence was the sharpest betrayal of all. Every time Margaret's cutting remarks landed, every subtle jab at my parents' background, I turned to him, hoping for even a flicker of defense. But Ethan remained passive, his eyes fixed on the floor or his hands fiddling with his phone. His refusal to confront his mother created an invisible chasm between us, one that grew wider with each passing incident. It wasn't just the moments at family dinners or community events where Margaret's disdain was on full display, it was the aftermath. When I tried to speak to Ethan, to express the hurt I felt for myself and for Lisa and Daniel, he would sigh, brushing off my concerns. "That's just how Mom is," he'd say, as though that made it excusable. "She doesn't mean any harm." But harm was exactly what she meant, and her words lingered long after the conversations had ended. Ethan's inaction made me feel not only isolated but abandoned. I had stood by him through everything, yet in this battle, the one that mattered most, he left me to face it alone. His passivity became a weight, suffocating the love I once thought would protect me. Ethan's silence was the sharpest betrayal of all. Every time Margaret's cutting remarks landed, every subtle jab at my parents' background, I turned to him, hoping for even a flicker of defense. But Ethan remained passive, his eyes fixed on the floor or his hands fiddling with his phone. His refusal to confront his mother created an invisible chasm between us, one that grew wider with each passing incident. It wasn't just the moments at family dinners or community events where Margaret's disdain was on full display, it was the aftermath. When I tried to speak to Ethan, to express the hurt I felt for myself and for Lisa and Daniel, he would sigh, brushing off my concerns. "That's just how Mom is," he'd say, as though that made it excusable. "She doesn't mean any harm." But harm was exactly what she meant. And her words lingered long after the conversations had ended. Ethan's inaction made me feel not only isolated but abandoned. I had stood by him through everything, yet in this battle, the one that mattered most, he left me to face it alone. His passivity became a weight, suffocating the love I once thought would protect me. Ethan's silence was a wound that deepened with every encounter. Margaret's sharp remarks cut through the air like shards of glass, calculated, deliberate, and laced with disdain. Each time, I looked to Ethan for support, hoping he'd speak up, defend me, or even offer a reassuring glance. But he stayed silent, his gaze lowered or distracted, as if distancing himself from the tension. That silence felt louder than any words his mother could have said. At family dinners, Margaret would make pointed comments about Lisa and Daniel's background, her tone dripping with condescension. At community events, her patronizing observations humiliated my parents in public, leaving me burning with anger and shame. When I brought this up to Ethan, his response was always the same: "You're overreacting. That's just how she is." It wasn't just his words, it was the dismissal. The refusal to see my pain or acknowledge the harm being done. His indifference turned what could have been a united front into a chasm of isolation. I had faced so many battles in life with him by my side. But now, in the war for my parents' dignity and my own respect, Ethan had chosen silence. That silence was deafening, and it eroded the trust and love I once held so dearly. Ethan's attempt to mediate only poured fuel on the fire. As Margaret reclined in her chair, feigning innocence, her words dripped with manipulation. "I'm being attacked for telling the truth," she said, her voice quivering just enough to play the victim. Her gaze darted to Ethan, seeking validation, and like clockwork, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual neutrality creeping in. "Let's not escalate this," Ethan said. His tone calm but detached, as if soothing a minor inconvenience rather than addressing the deep wound Margaret had inflicted. His words weren't directed at his mother, nor were they meant to defend me. They simply floated in the air, ineffective and insubstantial. The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave. While Margaret wielded her words like daggers, Ethan's refusal to take a firm stand felt like a slow, suffocating erosion of trust. I could no longer distinguish his passivity from complicity. The lump in my throat grew unbearable, and the tears I had fought to hold back finally spilled over. Pushing back my chair, I left the dinner, my vision blurred and my chest heavy. I vowed that this would be the last time I stayed silent. If Ethan wouldn't defend me, I would defend myself and my parents. Back at home, I could no longer contain my fury. "How can you just sit there and let her treat my parents like that?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. Ethan's shoulders slumped, his usual calm demeanor crumbling under the weight of my accusations. "She's my mom," he began, but the excuse sounded hollow even to him. I pressed on, my words sharp and relentless. "Being your mom doesn't give her the right to trample over my family's dignity." Ethan finally met my gaze, his expression torn. The anger in my voice and the pain in my eyes seemed to force him to confront what he had been avoiding. Silence hung between us as the reality of Margaret's actions and his complicity settled heavily in the air. I had reached my breaking point. That night, as Ethan sat across from me, I laid it out plainly, my voice steady but firm. "This stops now," I said, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "I won't allow Margaret to belittle my parents anymore, and I won't let you sit by in silence while she does it." Ethan looked startled, but I pressed on. "If she can't respect them, she doesn't need to be in our lives, and if you can't support me, I'll take the steps to protect my family's dignity myself." For the first time, the weight of my resolve hung heavy in the air, leaving no room for compromise. The air was thick with tension as we gathered for the holiday dinner. Lisa and Daniel sat quietly at the far end of the table, their presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the love that had shaped me. I had chosen not to inform Margaret beforehand. I couldn't bear to endure her disapproval before the evening even began. Predictably, Margaret's composure cracked halfway through the meal. As Daniel shared a story from my childhood, her sharp voice cut through the room. "Well, isn't it nice how resourceful you had to be?" she said, her tone dripping with condescension. The room fell silent. I placed my fork down deliberately, meeting Margaret's gaze with unwavering calm. "They gave me everything when they had nothing," I said, my voice steady. "Lisa and Daniel sacrificed more than you could imagine to raise me with love and dignity. I will not allow you to disrespect them in my home." Margaret's face froze, her usual composure faltering. For the first time, she seemed unsure of what to say. I could feel Ethan shifting uncomfortably beside me, but I didn't care. In that moment, I had finally drawn a line that could no longer be crossed. The room hung heavy with the weight of my words, the silence deafening. For a moment, I thought Ethan would remain rooted in his usual neutrality, but then he straightened in his chair. His voice, steady but resolute, broke the tension. "Mom," he said, turning to Margaret, "this has to stop. Your behavior is hurtful, and I won't allow it anymore. Lisa and Daniel deserve respect. And if you can't give them that, you're risking your place in our lives." Margaret's face hardened in defiance, but the shock in her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't used to Ethan challenging her. And it was clear the realization unsettled her. Her lips pressed into a thin line as the room waited for her response. Finally, she muttered, "I didn't mean to offend anyone. If I've hurt you, I apologize." The words were clipped, her tone lacking genuine remorse, but they carried weight nonetheless. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a step, one I doubted Margaret would have taken if Ethan hadn't spoken up. While her concession didn't heal the wounds she'd caused, it marked a shift. For the first time, I felt the tide turning in our family dynamic. As I sat in the quiet of our living room, the weight of the past months pressed heavily on me. The confrontations, the sharp words exchanged, and the pain etched on my parents' faces replayed in my mind like an unwelcome reel. Yet, amidst the turmoil, there was a flicker of solace and unwavering certainty that I had done what was right. Standing up to Margaret had not been easy. It had felt like wading through a storm, unsure of where the next blow would come from. But the look in Lisa and Daniel's eyes, their quiet pride in me for defending them, made every battle worth it. They had given me everything when they had so little to give. And their love deserved nothing less than my fiercest protection. Though Margaret's apology had been lukewarm at best, the boundaries I set felt like a small victory, a step toward preserving the dignity of my family. Ethan's eventual support gave me hope that, with time, our family might find balance. The journey had been painful, but it left me stronger, more certain of my values, and unshaken in my resolve to honor the love and sacrifices that shaped me.